The United States has portrayed itself as a vanguard of the civilized world, locked in a so-called war on terror. The justification for the trail of destruction and murder that Washington left behind in Iraq, Afghanistan, and elsewhere is that the U.S. is fighting evil and terror. Many have, of course, pointed out the hypocrisy of that very notion. But Washington's growing relations with the Mojahedin-e-Khalq organization, a terror group that has killed thousands of people, is indeed the height of that hypocrisy.
Dancing to tune of terrorists.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of We the People. I am your host, Daniel Arya. Now, the United States foreign policy has been hypocritical in so many ways. Washington's dealing with terror is perhaps the most striking case. For Washington, terrorists are divided into the good and bad. Now, many people who hear this would go, this is going too far. But if you look at Washington's relations with the MKO terror group, you can hardly dispute that. The group has killed thousands of Iranians in gross terrorist attacks. So gross, even Washington had the name of the MKO on its terrorist list up until the year 2012. Now, although the terror group has not changed one bit, U.S. is now considering it as an ally. So does such hypocrisy matter in U.S. foreign affairs? And to discuss just that, we are pleased to have our two guests on our show. Ken Stone from the Hamilton Coalition to Stop the War, joining us from Hamilton, Ontario, and Olsi Jasheshi, historian and journalist who is joining us from Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia. Stay tuned.
The United States and its Western allies have incited violent riots in Iran with every possible means. This included backing groups that could do the bidding inside the country, like the notorious Mojahedin-e-Khalq organization. The U.S. has recently hosted a gathering of anti-Iran groups in Washington to support rioters in Iran. Former senior American officials like Secretary of State Mike Pompeo attended the meeting. He has reportedly gone as far as to recognize the MKO leader Maryam Rajavi as the interim president of Iran and the so-called revolution that is happening there.
Now, the extent to which the American establishment has bought into the narratives projected by the MKO terrorist group is just unbelievable. To make such statements is either a sign of miscalculated policy or simply desperation. But why should the U.S. support a cult and terrorist group like the MKO really?
The answer is simple. Since the 1979 Islamic Revolution, Iran changed the mega projects of United States in the Middle East for the extermination of Palestine and the Palestinians. The support that Iran gave and gives to the issue of Palestine have turned Iran into enemy number one of the United States. And United States, in order to make sure that Israel and its apartheid regime will survive in the Middle East, will do anything on its power to destroy the Islamic Republic of Iran.
Now, the U.S. has used everything in its power to confront the Islamic Republic of Iran. Sanctions, a maximum pressure campaign, and of course, terrorism. So what role does the latter play in the larger Washington's policy towards Iran?
From the end of the Second World War until about 1979, the U.S. dominated the Middle East. However, in 1979, the Iranian Revolution took place and pulled out one of the main pillars of the U.S. domination. The other two pillars, namely Saudi Arabia and Israel, remained in place. Since 1979, the U.S. has been trying with various means to destabilize and overturn the Islamic Republic. They have used proxy wars, such as with Iraq. They have used economic sanctions. They have used maximum pressure campaigns, and they have used terrorism. And among the most prominent terrorist organizations that they have used, aside from the State of Israel, of course, is the MKO. The MKO is the organization that the U.S. has nurtured for decades, first in Iraq, and then stationed with thousands of warriors in the U.S. proxy state of Albania. So the MKO is the principal terrorist organization on which the U.S. relies for the destabilization and the eventual overthrow, in their opinion, of the Islamic Republic of Iran.
A couple of years ago, John Bolton, in a meeting with MKO officials, projected that the Islamic Republic's days are numbered.
For over 10 years since coming to these events, that the declared policy of the United States of America should be the overthrow of the mullah's regime in Tehran. The behavior and the objectives of the regime are not going to change, and therefore the only solution is to change the regime itself. And that's why before 2019, we here will celebrate in Tehran. Thank you very much.
In remarks that strike a familiar tone, some U.S. officials in the recent meeting in Washington have projected the same thing. It seems Washington is taking no page from its past mistakes.
This represents, actually, is wishful thinking on the part of U.S. politicians such as John Bolton. Actually, despite 44 years of attempts at the destabilization of Iran and the suffering that the Iranian people have had to endure as a result of sanctions and hybrid warfare, the fact is that the government of the Islamic Republic enjoys and still continues to enjoy the widespread support of the majority of people in Iran.
Now, the U.S. and its allies have been voicing outright support for the rioters who have been trying to hijack recent protests in Iran. Large numbers of Iranian civilians and security forces have died in the riots so far as the Western allies increasingly glorify the violence. Now, Iranian intelligence apparatus has recently arrested MKO agents in connection with the violence.
Our viewers throughout the world have to understand the bigger picture. And the bigger picture, and the reason why Iran is being attacked with fake news, with riots. Many of the rioters we know very well, they were being paid. They were receiving a huge amount of money from US and European government to go and attack public institutions in Iran. And the Mojahedin as well. They are part of this greater web and this continuing war which is waged against Iran since 1979. The Americans and Israelis will never stop sponsoring any kind of terrorist group, including the notorious cult of Maryam Rajavi that can harm Iran.
Many would say it is Trump's team, or generally Republicans, that are publicly supporting the MKO so much. Is there a difference between Democrats and Republicans in their policy towards the terror group?
There is no fundamental difference between Republicans and Democrats on the question of Iran. When they are in power or out of power, the goal remains the same, namely the regime change in Tehran. Now, in practice, it's more difficult for a sitting president such as Biden to deal with a known terrorist organization as the MKO while he is in office in Washington. It's much easier for Mr. Trump, who is now out of power and out of favor in Washington, to make louder noises in support of the MKO. But fundamentally, when they are in power, it makes no difference between Republicans and Democrats as to the outlook of the United States towards Iran, and that outlook remains regime change.
The U.S. instrumental use of terrorists to advance its agenda is not confined to the MKO. Donald Trump claimed that former President Barack Obama and former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton founded ISIS, or the Daesh terrorist group.
Look, if we see U.S. government policies towards the Mujahideen, they still do consider the Mujahideen as terrorists. Maryam Rajavi, she is not allowed to enter in the United States and the United Kingdom. So for the British and the Americans, Maryam Rajavi, the Mujahideen, they are terrorists. But for as long as these terrorists serve to the imperialist agenda of the United States, they are on the side of Americans. We know very well the story of the emails of Hillary Clinton, when one of her officials was telling to Clinton that ISIS is on our side in Syria. So exactly like the Americans used ISIS against the government of Bashar al-Assad, the same thing they are doing against Iran.
Now, the MKO has a very dark history of assassinations and bombings against the Iranian government and people. It notoriously sided with former Iraqi dictator Saddam Hussein during Iraq's 1980 to 1988 war against the Islamic Republic. But after fall of the Iraqi dictator, the group had to leave Iraq and now resides in Albania. Now, if the United States cherishes the MKO so much, why isn't the group allowed to enter America?
The Americans didn't, when they evacuated the Mujahideen from Iraq, they didn't send them to the United Kingdom, they didn't send them to the European Union, they didn't send them even in the United States. They found a lawless country like Albania is, which is run by a very corrupt government, which all people who know about what is happening in Albania, they know that most of the ministers of the present government of Edi Rama, they are corrupt, and some of his ministers, they are even in jail for trafficking drugs or stealing state properties. So the Americans found a lawless country like Albania is, where even the local laws do not work, and they send them there. In a way, the Americans, when they evacuated Mecca from Iraq, they needed to find a Guantanamo. But Guantanamo, where they built their infamous prison in Cuba, is too far, so they created a European Guantanamo in Albania. The Americans know very well what Mecca does in its camp.
Now, the MKO used to be regarded as a terrorist organization even by Washington itself, but is now helping the U.S. devise its policies against Iran. Seems like the U.S. has a classification for good and bad terrorists.
The U.S. Does have a two-tiered classification of armed struggles going on around the world. They support, the U.S. supports terrorist groups and has supported terrorist groups for its own foreign policy ends. And I'm referring to, for example, ISIS in Iraq and Syria, Al-Qaeda in the former Yugoslavia, the Contras in Nicaragua, and the Azov Battalion in Ukraine. These are ones that the U.S. regards as, quote, freedom fighters, and they support. But true freedom fighters, such as the Palestinians, who are fighting against the occupation of their homeland by the apartheid state of Israel, in the eyes of the U.S. government, these are regarded as terrorists.
Now, of course, the US public is not told that their politicians are working with a terrorist organization. There must have been a spin narrative or propaganda. The meeting in Washington, for example, is referred to in the media as a gathering of Iranian opposition groups.
The Western mainstream media has little or no independence of Western governments. It merely echoes the policies of their corporate masters and their governments. And so when the United States sees freedom fighters in Ukraine or freedom fighters in Syria or any other country where it has an ulterior motive to destabilize or overthrow a government, the mainstream media holds up these terrorist mercenaries as heroes. On the other hand, the mainstream media again echoes the positions of the U.S. government and the corporation, the corporate class in North America.
The MKO works as a kind of proxy group for the United States and its allies. European countries and their media, in particular Albania, also go to great lengths to whitewash the cult.
The Mujahideen first came to Albania. Albanian, Greek, Serbian, Italian media, and many other European medias, including British media, they reported a lot on the cruel nature of this terrorist cult. But what has happened during the past years, the Americans and the Mujahideen themselves and Israelis, they have done all they can to blackmail European medias and to keep a censorship about what the Mujahideens are doing in Albania. We know with our first-hand experience in Albania, the Mujahideens, they have blackmailed dozens of TV stations and newspapers in Albania, which were reporting the horrible situation of the Mujahideen slave soldiers within the camp of Maryam Rajavi. What the Mujahideens did against this media, in some cases, they used Albanian security services to blackmail the owners of this media. In other cases, when they couldn't use these services, they used bribes. They paid huge amount of money to many TV stations and newspapers so that they write nothing about them.
Throughout history, the United States has used militias and terrorist groups to serve its interests in one form or another. Now, these groups are special assets for a country like America, a country that is constantly at war with other nations. Foot soldiers on the ground really matter here, and armed militia and terrorists are a great option.
The U.S. maintains other terrorist groups in other countries, such as ISIS and Al-Qaeda, which have been shown over and over again to have been and are still U.S. assets. And the U.S. maintains a number of groups, fascist, neo-Nazi groups in Ukraine, the most notorious of which was the Azov Battalion. All of these groups served one purpose, and that is to allow the U.S. to use these people as their foot soldiers on the ground in theaters of conflict where the U.S. wanted to destabilize a government or establish a new regime or start a new war. And the U.S. can do this because it is a powerful empire and it can print its dollars endlessly. At least it's been able to do so up to now because the U.S. dollar has been the means of savings and exchange for most of the countries of the world up to the point of the war in Ukraine. So the U.S. has done this in many areas of the world, and it continues to maintain these terrorist groups on the payroll, along with leaders of these groups and political leaders that they keep in various places in exile, just to be used in case they are necessary for some foreign policy aim.
The MKO is a much hated group inside Iran, even among the opposition. After all, the cult-like organization sided with Saddam Hussein in his war on Iran in the 1980s. Many would say the MKO is a spent force and that Washington is just betting on the wrong horse here. Does the US change its approach towards the group in the future?
Well, like the special American envoy for Iran, Robert Malley, declared a few weeks ago in one of his declarations, the Americans do not see MEK as an alternative to the government of Iran, for which the Mujahideen they attacked back Robert Malley. Now, what the Americans are doing with MEK is exactly what they did with ISIS and Jabhat al-Nusra. God forbid, if one day we will have a regime change in Iran, the first thing that the Americans will do after this is they will either kill the Mujahideens or they will jail them and they will force them to de-radicalize themselves. Exactly what they did with the Syrian terrorists of Daesh and Jabhat al-Nusra. So the Mujahideens, they are a ticking bomb for the Americans. They know who they are, but they use them for as long as they serve to their agenda.
It's hard to predict the future, but we can certainly say that the U.S. maintains such groups for its foreign policy ends, despite the fact that the MKO is very unpopular in Iran because it has been responsible for almost 20,000 deaths over the last 40 years. Nonetheless, the U.S. Has many tools it keeps in its foreign policy toolbox, and terrorist organizations such as the MKO are one of them. We would hope that the U.S. government, someone in the U.S. government at some point, would realize that Iran, the Iranian Revolution, and the Islamic Republic of Iran are here to stay, and to learn to live with the Iranian Republic and the people of Iran in a friendly manner instead of treating it as an enemy and illegally meddling in its internal affairs, which it does all the time and has done so since 1953.
The United States' cooperation with the MKO is a clear-cut case of the maxim of the end justifies the means. It is very simple. Just because the terror group is against Iran, the US supports it. That's it. And all the talks about the human rights and justice and so on really matter nothing here. For Washington, good terrorists like the MKO are assets that can advance its policies in West Asia. Period.
The United States has gone through great lengths to counter Iran's growing clout in the region. Many would say wars in Iraq and Afghanistan were launched as a wider policy to contain Iran. Wars that have cost over $8 trillion, that's according to former President Donald Trump. Now, of course, Uncle Sam would have no shame to ask a terror group like the MKO for help. It's cost effective and involves less loss of lives and materials for the U.S. And that was our show, everyone. Thank you for watching. I am your host, Daniel Arya. Do join us again next time for another episode of We the People. Bye-bye for now.